Imagine the sheer terror, right? You're uprooting your entire extended family, leaving the literal only homeland you've ever known, and walking straight into the borders of a massive foreign superpower. That was the monumental, real-life stake facing the ancient patriarch Jacob. But then, a divine voice in the night whispers a promise that basically alters the course of history. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation.
So let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are peeling back the layers of one of the most famous family reunions in all of human history, Jacob's descent into Egypt to finally reunite with his long-lost son Joseph. But look, we aren't just reading a simple bedtime story today. We're going to decode the text to find the hidden history, the fascinating linguistics, and honestly, an invisible literary architecture that will absolutely blow your mind.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're covering 1. The vision at Beersheba, 2. 70 or 75, 3. Egyptian customs and loanwords, 4. The Goshen strategy, and 5. Literary symmetry and structure.
Section 1. The vision at Beersheba. Let's establish the physical and emotional starting point of this whole epic relocation. The sheer spatial reality of this journey is it's staggering. Jacob is an old man at this point, and he's not packing for a weekend trip. He is moving an entire clan. We're talking wagons, cattle, goods, kids, grandkids, the whole shebang. They're moving from the hills of Canaan, down through the harsh, arid Negev desert, straight to Beersheba, which was basically the final outpost before crossing the Egyptian border. And Beersheba, it was deeply significant. It was the exact place where both his father and grandfather had encountered the divine. So standing right there on the precipice of leaving the Promised Land, Jacob desperately needed some reassurance.
And reassurance is exactly what he gets. In a night vision, he receives 4 specific, crucial promises. First, a direct command. Do not be afraid. Second, the promise of divine presence. God literally promises to go down into Egypt with him. Third, the guarantee of a future return. This meant Egypt was just an incubator, not the final destination. But the fourth point, this is the deeply personal one. Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. Wow. After decades of mourning a son he thought was torn to pieces by wild animals, Jacob is promised that this very son is alive and will be right there to gently close his eyes when he passes away. All right, moving into Section 2, 70 or 75. With that comforting promise in hand, the family moves. But exactly how many people actually made this trek? Let's solve a little textual detective story. If you read the standard Hebrew Bible, what we call the Masoretic text, it boldly claims that exactly 70 descendants of Jacob went to Egypt. It lists them out name by name and summarizes it perfectly. Now, in ancient literature, the number 70 isn't just basic math, it heavily symbolizes completeness and totality. It actually mirrors the 70 nations of the world listed earlier in Genesis. But here is where it gets super fascinating. If we check the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, as well as fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the number isn't 70 at all. It's 75. In the Masoretic text, Joseph's descendants are just his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. But the Septuagint lists 5 missing names, a son and grandson for Manasseh, and 2 sons and a grandson for Ephraim.
So this brings up a massive question, right? Why would an ancient scribe intentionally delete grandsons and great-grandsons from the official historical record? Why actively alter the count from 75 down to 70? Was it just a typo, a mistake? Well, no. Scholars actually believe it was highly intentional.
And the text's own internal timeline brilliantly illustrates why. Let's do the math real quick. Joseph was 30 when he rose to power. Then there were 7 years of plenty, and Jacob arrived 2 years into the subsequent famine. That makes Joseph exactly 39 years old when his father finally arrives. Now, the text says Joseph's sons were born before the famine. That means Ephraim and Manasseh are, at the absolute most, 8 or 9 years old when Jacob arrives in Egypt. So how on earth could 9-year-old boys have children and grandchildren making the trip? It's a biological impossibility. So scholars suggest a later scribe realized this massive chronological loophole and simply fixed the text by deleting the impossible unborn grandchildren, neatly reducing the number back to a perfect, symbolic 70.
Okay, Section 3. Egyptian customs and loanwords. Let's pivot from textual discrepancies to cultural history and explore the authentic fingerprints the Egyptians left all over this narrative.
You see, the author of this text wasn't just blindly guessing about life in Egypt. They had an intimate, truly authentic familiarity with it. Take the word abrek, for example. When Joseph is elevated to power, He rides in a chariot, and the crowds cry out, Abrek. For centuries, scholars debated this word because, honestly, it doesn't fit standard Hebrew at all. But the consensus today, it's an Egyptian loanword meaning bow the knee, directly imported into the Hebrew text. It perfectly captures the royal Egyptian etiquette of that exact time period.
We also see this deep cultural embedding at the very end of the story when Jacob dies. Just consider the incredibly specific funerary practices here. The text explicitly notes that Joseph used physicians, not priests, to embalm his father. This aligns flawlessly with the highly specialized medical class of ancient Egypt. On top of that, the text states the embalming took exactly 40 days, followed by 70 days of national mourning. And guess what? Archaeological and historical records from Egypt confirm these highly specific timeframes. The text is literally dripping with authentic Egyptian culture.
Which brings us to Section 4, the Goshen strategy. Here we see a fascinating sociological tension, where Joseph turns a massive cultural prejudice into a brilliant tactical advantage.
Joseph actually coaches his brothers on what to say when they finally meet Pharaoh. He tells them to proudly declare they are shepherds, specifically because, and I quote, "Every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians." I mean, that is a shocking statement. Joseph's family is walking headfirst into an intense wall of classism and cultural divide.
But where did this prejudice even come from? Well, it wasn't necessarily that the Egyptians thought the animals themselves were physically unclean. Actually, they revered the cow. It was sacred to the goddess Isis, and they used oxen for farming all the time. Instead, the hatred was rooted entirely in class and lifestyle. Egypt was a highly advanced, settled agricultural society. They deeply, deeply despised the vagrant, tent-dwelling nomadic lifestyle of shepherds. To a sophisticated Egyptian, wandering herdsmen were basically uncultured barbarians. So, you might be wondering, why would Joseph purposely lean into this disdain? Simply put, it was a brilliant strategy for survival. It's divine preservation through worldly rejection. By highlighting their status as shepherds, Joseph practically guaranteed that Pharaoh would segregate them. And they were. They were given the land of Goshen, a super fertile region but physically separated from the main Egyptian populace. God essentially used what the world despised to isolate and protect this small family from total cultural assimilation, giving them the space they needed to grow into a massive nation.
Finally, Section 5, literary symmetry and structure. Let's zoom all the way out now to marvel at the invisible, perfectly balanced architecture holding this entire ancient text together.
To really understand this, we need to look at a concept called a chiasm. A chiasm is an ancient literary device where a sequence of events or themes is presented and then beautifully mirrored in reverse order. So it goes A, B, C, and then works backward, C prime, B prime, A prime. It creates this incredibly symmetrical ring of text.
And you can see how this builds across the entire Joseph narrative, from Genesis 37 all the way to 50. The story kicks off at point A with the parting of Jacob and Joseph. Now jump to the mirrored side at A prime. The story ends with their final parting at Jacob's death. Drop down to D. Joseph becomes the hero of Egypt in chapters 40 and 41. This is perfectly mirrored at D prime in chapter 47, where he once again acts as the hero of Egypt, managing the land during the famine. The narrative climax sits perfectly right in the middle at F and F prime, Judah's final test, and Joseph's dramatic, emotional reveal to his brothers. Literally every preceding event is beautifully mirrored by a subsequent event.
Let's look a bit closer at sections E and E prime. In the first half of the story, section E, the brothers make 2 physical trips down to Egypt to get food. In the second half, section E prime, the author perfectly balances this by giving us 2 distinct tellings of the final migration. One telling is that long genealogy list we discussed earlier, and the second is the physical presentation of the brothers to Pharaoh. So what initially looks like a random, clunky inclusion of a genealogy list was actually a deliberate mathematical necessity by the editor to structure and balance out those 2 earlier trips. And this symmetry, it isn't just thematic, it's linguistic. The author stitches the beginning and the end of the story together using highly specific shared vocabulary. Both sections prominently feature the exact phrase, land of Canaan. Both use the exact same Hebrew root word for evil. Both focus heavily on the act of mourning. And remember back in chapter 37 when Joseph dreams of his brothers bowing down? Well, in chapter 50, they literally fall down before his face. The textual editing here is absolutely masterful.
So, what's the big takeaway from all this? Beneath what looks like a simple, straightforward Sunday school story of a family reunion lies a phenomenally complex web. We've uncovered intentional textual editing to protect timelines, linguistic history filled with Egyptian loanwords, the careful maneuvering of ancient class dynamics, and a brilliant, mathematically balanced literary design.
Ancient texts are incredibly sophisticated, layered masterpieces that deeply reward focused analysis.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. If ancient editors were this careful, structuring chiastic symmetry, hiding linguistic clues, and intentionally managing chronological loopholes in just this one story, what other invisible designs are waiting to be uncovered across the vast library of ancient historical literature? Keep reading closely, keep looking for the structure, and keep learning. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I will see you next time.